Welcome back to A Year of Final Fantasy, and we are in the month of Siren, coming up fast on the game of the month, Final Fantasy II. But first I'd like to shed a little light on something I had no idea actually even existed until I started researching this. Actual official novelizations of Final Fantasy games. Initially I had intentions of going over these novels one by one, but as I've begun my research and adding to my list of topics, I've just decided to talk about the novels as a whole. Seeing as they're all pretty much in Japanese only, I won't talk about the content of the novels as much, I just want to make you aware of them. There are a few that did make it over to the West, and I'll point those out as we go along. So I'm going to start by going in chronological order, and I'm not going to talk about manga or comics or anything like that right now. I will tackle those later on, but right now I'm just talking about novelizations themselves. So as far as I can tell, there exists no such novel solely of Final Fantasy I. So fitting as it is, this being the month of Final Fantasy II, the first novel that came out is actually a retelling of Final Fantasy II. The novel was entitled Final Fantasy II Mumo no Miku, and that may be completely wrong, I'm sorry. It was released in April of 1989 in Japan, and the title roughly translates to Labyrinth of Nightmare. So even though that did come out quite early in the Final Fantasy lifetime, the pure novelization seemed to have been halted until the release of the critically panned Final Fantasy Spirits Within, having a novelization of the movie that came out right around the same time of release on June 26, 2001. Interestingly enough, this was an American-only release, so yay to America for the honor of having that fantastic novel. So after the Spirits Within opened up the floodgate of novel releases again, soon thereafter a novella telling a side story of Final Fantasy Unlimited released in March 2002. This side adventure was known as So Nu Kizuna, translating roughly to The Bonds of Two. We've already talked a little bit about the anime of Final Fantasy Unlimited. Many other forms of the media from Unlimited have come up as well, despite widely being regarded as an incomplete series. That being said, about the incompleteness of the series, they did something to kind of remedy that, not necessarily in the way most people may have wanted it, but they did give us closure, and that form of closure came in the novels that appeared in the official Final Fantasy Unlimited website, fittingly named Final Fantasy Unlimited After. This follows hot on the heels of So No Kizuna coming out only a few months after in 2002. At this point in time, we start wandering into the realms of the next big Final Fantasy game, Final Fantasy XI, in which several different types of media begin to emerge as promotional material for the game. There did exist a series of novels set in the continuity of 11 that released in May of 2003. Though this series of novels didn't make it to the States, it was however translated into German and French later. Sadly, as far as I can tell, no proper English version exists. So as the hype of Final Fantasy XI kind of died down a little bit, we get in the point in time where the fervor of Final Fantasy VII fans had grown a lot, and as such, Square announced several games to expand the universe of 7. Along with those games, a collection of 2 novellas were released worldwide to promote the new series of Final Fantasy VII games. Properly called On the Way to a Smile, the novellas themselves were entitled Case of Denzel and Case of Tifa. And you can find these books in the Final Fantasy VII Advent Children Prologue book that was released in Japan on September 14th, 2005. As they made their way over to the West 2 years later, we did get another short specifically written for us Americans known as The Case of Barrett. Surprisingly enough, 4 more stories in this novella series were written, known as The Case of Yuffie, Case of Red 13, Case of Shinra, and Case of the Life Stream. These stories came out in 2009, and they were all grouped together and published as an anthology in Japan only. So after the enthusiasm of Final Fantasy VII games being released, Square, I guess, took that to heart and started revisiting their older games, and with this, we got the announcement of Final Fantasy IV The After Years, which was a complete surprise to everyone. And with this announcement, there was initially a 2-part novelization of Final Fantasy IV, released in late 2008 in Japan, followed by a novelization of Final Fantasy IV After Years just a few months later in March of 2009. And so, after looking to the past, Square began to look to the future, and we come up at the end of the decade when Square began pushing Final Fantasy XIII quite hard. And as that game started becoming the talk of Final Fantasy fans, Square released a series of novels on the web known as Final Fantasy XIII Episode 0 Promise, which details the events preceding the proper Final Fantasy XIII game. More recently, in 2012, on October 31st, Halloween, we began to come full circle as the novel known as Final Fantasy Fantasy Memory of Heroes released, detailing 3 short stories, each of which cover Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3. Now at the beginning I said Final Fantasy 1 didn't have a novelization, and I was referring specifically to a release that was only targeted at Final Fantasy 1. But this did come out, so if you want to quell that itch of Final Fantasy 1 in a novelization, you can find that here. So as of this recording, the most recent entry in the novelizations of the games come from Final Fantasy 15. A small novella called Final Fantasy 15 Prologue: Parting Ways acts as a primer for Final Fantasy XV, detailing the events before the game. This did come out in the US, and I highly recommend reading it even before you start playing Final Fantasy XV. If you've already begun playing Final Fantasy XV, stop and go and read this now. It tells you a lot about the characters and why they're with each other, and more things like that that I think should have been included in the game itself. Anyway, as far as the novels go, this brings us to the end of this episode, and we're shutting down the end of a month of Siren. Next time, to properly send off Siren, we'll take a look at the second game in the series, Final Fantasy II. So until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.